So to this point, we've been able to replicate a layout that took us considerably longer using just plain CSS in just a few minutes by using Skeleton, really, once we got started. So there's a couple of things we want to fix, though. The main one being a usability issue as well as an aesthetic issue, which is that once we get to these middle widths, so somewhere between 550 and, if you watch the numbers while I'm resizing my device window here, the overlap begins to really be an issue right around 860, I would say, just because of the space between portfolio and resume. So somewhere between 550 and around 860, we have some issues with our navigation bar overlapping, and that's something that's going to call for a custom media query for us to fix. Now, we can do that in browser just to see the effect, and what I would do is take a look at it at one of the most narrow, so just before that 550 is hit, right around 551 here. We're going to create a new media query for this. This media query is going to span between a min width and a max width instead of just being one. So most of the media queries you see are either targeting a min width or a max width and everything above or below. But in this case, we can also target a span. So let's add a new media query here. And I'm going to go actually from largest to smallest in my, or widest to most narrow in my order here. So I'm going to do this above this other media query. And I'm going to type @media screen. And in this case, we're going to have a min width and a max width. Min width is going to be just above 550, so 551. By the way, guys, there's no fractional value of a pixel. Pixel is the smallest unit of measure. Other units of measure can have decimal points, but pixels are pixels. And then we also need to have and max width of, what did we say, 860? And then we're going to open up some curly braces for our media query, and then we're going to add some CSS declarations in there to target that. So right now it's actually just the text size, and most of the text is being dealt with within the anchor elements for these. So the farthest nested piece. So what I really need to call out here is header, nav. I probably don't need to drill down through all the UL, LI. I can probably just grab A. And I can do font size. Now remember, we're using rims, so we've got our base value here of, I think it was 16 or 18 pixels. So I can take this one down though to, let's see, initially, let's take a look up here. Initially our base size, my base size is 18 pixels, and then my navigation was sized maybe a little differently there. I'm not seeing. Oh, I know why. I've got my link states down here, so maybe my anchor is here too. No? Okay. So it looks like my navigation's just right here at this 18 pixels as the base, because it doesn't look like I styled a different font size for the navigation anywhere here. So I need something smaller than 18 pixels, basically. So I need something smaller than one rim. So what I could do here is change my font size to maybe 0.8 rim. And you see they got smaller, not quite small enough. So let's go down to a 0.7, a little better. 0.6, it's getting a little small for a mobile device. So I'm going to come back up to 0.7, and then I'm going to get rid of my letter spacing that I had here. So I can do that by just adding a letter spacing property here. And I can zero that out to maybe one rim. And let's see, let's take it in even further. 0.5. Doesn't seem to be responding to that. So let me see what's going on there. The letter spacing may be on something else. Yeah, I think I'm just, it's 0.2 rim. So maybe I take that down to 0.1. It still doesn't seem to be responding. I wonder if it's because of the specificity. There, it's responding now. So the fact that I had more classes called out here, or more tags called out in that top tag than this one, was getting in the way of me using shorthand here. So now I've removed it. And so this is the worst it's going to get, basically, as far as the spacing goes there. So we could take that down even further to maybe 0.08. That starts to look a little bit better. And then as we size up, that's probably going to feel kind of small in places. But you can see once we hit a reasonable position here above 860, it jumps back up to the size that it needs to be. Now, likewise, when we get down below 550, it'll be resized to be larger. So spanning a range of widths is actually a really helpful skill and tool to have in your toolkit. So that took care of that. Let's take care of this while we're at the bottom here too. These icons feel awfully big at this same range. So it might be on a phone that we would want them to be bigger. You have to think about the fact that on a mobile device, people are tapping things with their fingers instead of clicking on things with a mouse pointer. And so sometimes bigger is actually better on the most narrow of screens that we have. But in those middle widths, we really want to consider that. But I would say here, I'm okay with the size of these icons right up until, honestly, just until they start to get kind of squished together here below 550. So let's do this one on this max width of 550 pixels. And what this is going to be overriding is, if you remember, we used Font Awesome and a class that makes these scale to be 2 times the size that they're intended to be. So what we really need to do is override that Font Awesome class. So let's come back to our elements really quickly and examine some of these icons. If we take a look at this icon, we can see that this FA-2XL is what's causing that size to increase to 2, and they're using M's, which is really tricky. I'm not going to get into that for a beginning level class, but just know that RIMs are a lot simpler and more straightforward. So let's see, they're using 2 M's. So what we could do is take that down by calling out that same class. So that was a class of .fa-2XL. Now, what we may want to do, though, is grab only the ones of these in the footer again. Time will tell as we add other icons to our project. But since there are only icons right now using that class in the footer, I'm just going to call that out specifically. And I'm going to give it a font size of, instead of 2M, I'm going to try 1 rim. You see that takes them down to a much smaller size, and probably matches the one that would be up here, you know, as a standard size. These might be a little bit small, so maybe we go 1.5. That feels a little bit more balanced right up until they start to get kind of crowded together, but even there, I think that that feels appropriate for the size of a phone, so I probably wouldn't go much smaller than that. So we have one other discussion to have, though, which is the rest of our typography. Right, I had you specifically make sure that you did all of your typography using RIMs for a reason, and now's the time for me to show you the benefit of that reason. So for everything that I just did, I might not have needed to do it because I also feel like the text here is way too big, at least for the headings, right? But what I could do, if I was really happy with the proportions of all of the text on the page as far as the hierarchy that's being applied to each one in terms of scale, so in terms of font size anyway, I could make these responsive with a single declaration in a media query. So what I could do is come to my media query of my max width of 550 here. And let's say, for the sake of argument, I felt like all this text was too big. In this case, I don't actually feel like it's just the headings. I think the paragraph text getting much smaller is going to be a problem. But I want to show you how this works. So let's say that I felt like this was getting too big all around. Well, if I've done this right, if I've set up my base font size in the HTML, body declaration, and then I've sized everything else that I want to be relative to that using RIMs, then I could actually fix this by putting an override for that one property of that declaration in a media query. So if I come here and I add that HTML body and font size. I can just change that base value from 18 to, let's say, 16. And you see everything sized down, but they kept their proportions as relative to one another. So let's take that down. Let's take that down to something significantly smaller so that you can kind of see what I mean. If I go down to maybe 12, you see how everything kept that same hierarchy, which again could use a little bit of work, especially if you were to have headings with this many words in them, you'd want to consider that, but most likely you probably won't. These are more descriptive so that you understand what they're used for, but usually headings are, a line or two, so it wouldn't quite be this garish. But you see how all of our text jumped down, including our line spacing. Our letter spacing will adjust accordingly as well, all based on being relative to this number. So I could come back up here and I could change this to at least a 16. And if I did that, I might not even need to have these, individual adjustments for things if I was happy with the whole scale of everything on the page, all the proportions, and I just wanted to scale them down in proportion. This one declaration would take care of that. But you can also resize, very specific elements at certain screen widths as well. And there's really no limit to how much you can do this as long as you understand how to apply media queries to achieve it. So you can choose something that is a min width, so that would be everything at that size and above, or you can target a max width, so everything at that size and below. You can target a range of widths, so min and max width, and so everything in between those two sizes. And also you can actually target heights with media queries. There's also min height, max height that you can use. We don't use them that much, but if you consider the use case of this website on a mobile phone at landscape orientation, it might be worth considering. It all depends on, what the use case is for your website and how you expect people to be using it, or more importantly, how your research shows people are using it would probably be the better metric to follow. You might end up using heights for that as well. Usually, when that comes into play, people are probably looking more at a mobile app, but it can be done on a website if it needs to be. So with all of that said, all we really need to do now is get our style guide up to par as well. Now, one thing that's kind of bothering me, though, is this little bit of space on either side of this button. So why don't we go ahead and fix that real quick. First, we're going to find where the offending element is, right? What's causing that? And I think it's actually this class of row. Oh, actually it's the container having padding left and right up here. So what we may want to do is find that nav, or the headers container anyway. You see this padding of 0 and 20 pixels? It's the 20 pixels that's doing that. So what we may want to do is below 550 pixels, we may want to grab, not all of them. I feel like this amount of space is actually appropriate for containers, but maybe my header container, possibly my footer container. For now, I'm just going to target the header. So I'm going to do this. I still like to style things from top to bottom of page as well. So I'm going to put this above my footer declarations. And I'm going to grab header, anything inside the header with a class of container, which is just the nav. And give it padding of 0. And you see how that kind of helps with the button spanning all the way across. That looks a little bit better to me. And then you can see where we still have it here, so we might even want a separate media query that handles that. That padding's probably coming from somewhere else that Skeleton gets rid of at that size. Let's see. Let's see where else it can be coming from. Yeah, now it's actually coming from margins on the container, it looks like. Let's see. Yeah, it's still got that 0 and auto right here for margins. I think that's what's causing it here. I'm not seeing anything else getting highlighted. So yeah, it's the container again. So what we could do is also come back to this and give margins of 0 as well. That starts to create some new issues for us. Let's see, I think it was actually on, no, it was on nav, wasn't it? And so now we've got, let's see what's happening here now. So now it's just not spanning 100%. That's this width of 85%. So we could add one additional property here, width of 100%. And now that navbar looks a whole lot better to me for mobile, and I haven't affected anything else because I've been specific enough to just target my header. And so now I can see how things are starting to shape up, and that's looking pretty good overall. There's some things I still would want to do with the typography, but overall I think especially the header and footer in terms of usability have come a long way. So one thing I need to do before I move on is make sure I save this. So I'm going to do a quick save as on styles.css and make sure that it gets saved to my local version. Let me go check that here and just make sure those last media queries and selectors made it in. And it looks like they did. So then the last thing I have to do is just make sure that I update my style guide for this. So we'll cover that in a separate video, but we'll do that and then we'll be done.